Ronald Reagan, president, hero, savior, the man and politician who single-handedly defeated the Red Terror, otherwise known as the Soviet Union and communism. Ronald Reagan, the great conservative, and the conservative whom we all need in today's troubled times, the man for all times and all moments. Or was he? Did Ronald Reagan single-handedly defeat the Soviet Union? Or had the Soviet Union been on a decades-long negative track record prior to Ronald Reagan assuming the office of president? Was it not more likely that the initiative of Mikhail Gorbachev, who voluntarily ended the Soviet Union, a more important factor than Ronald Reagan simply being president and speaking out against communism? What was Reagan's actual track record, all things considered? Well, in 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act was signed into law by the then President Ronald Reagan. This Immigration Reform and Control Act changed U.S. immigration law, rendering it illegal to knowingly hire illegal immigrants and imposing financial and other penalties for companies that employed illegal immigrants. But the act also legalized most illegal immigrants who had arrived in the country prior to January 1st, 1982. And Ronald Reagan was also a big believer in amnesty. Quote, "I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and lived here, even though sometime back they may have entered illegally," end quote. Not a terribly conservative idea, though, if you think about it. True, Ronald Reagan cut taxes, but what recent Republican president has not done that? That is like cereal and milk. Pretty much any Republican has done that. And what about Ronald Reagan's tenure as governor of California? Perhaps most infamous and well-known was the radical introduction of so-called no-fault divorce. California Governor Ronald Reagan signed the Family Law Act of 1969, thereby abolishing the fault grounds for divorce, replacing it with only no fault. But yes, what about the taxes? Well, Ronald Reagan was somewhat better on matters of taxes. For example, he signed into law the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, which introduced major tax cuts, or the Tax Reform of 1986, which was an attempt to simplify the tax code. But the question is, how much does that balance out the other issues mentioned? And an actual examination of the so-called Reagan era yields at best mixed results. At worst, a poor two terms, and is hardly reflective of the over-glorified legacy attributed to him, which is not to be found in the details of his tenure. He was not a conservative hero, nor did he single-handedly save the world from the red menace of communism. It was far more a case that a mediocre or average president was thrust into a concatenation of historical contingencies outside of himself. And it really was just an accident of history that Reagan was president at that particular juncture in time. If anything, the epoch surrounding him was the thing that was most remarkable, and he was a mere player on the stage, a far, far cry from the posthumous legend that your typical conservative boomers want to recite in rapt devotion. Time serves to distort the historical record, and an average personality can grow beyond the confines of its true standing with faulty memory and hyperbole. But that is apolitical. What of the hyperbolic in another venue? Now, people likely these days know more about the fitness industry than ever before. Its jests and jibes, its deception, and above all, its image. And by image, I mean what you see is almost never what you get, as whether in terms of athletes presenting themselves in relation to product X, or simply showing off to the world in terms that would be supraphysiological, so to speak, I can think of no industry where the phrase grand deception is more applicable. Let's begin with the supplement industry, which uses implied but non-existent correlations to peddle their wares. A huge ripped athlete proudly standing behind his chosen brand of creatine or whey protein powder, or amino acids, which, it is implicitly claimed, is the reason why he looks as superhumanly impressive as he does at 6% body fat, at 5'9", and weighing in at 230 pounds. And more importantly, is the implicit claim that you, the person observing such a physique, can achieve just such a body, provided you slurp down whatever supplements are being sold. It works above all in the young and impressionable, and even in the year 2020, there's a sucker born every minute. They won't, of course, tell you that the athlete on display is massively enhanced through Photoshop, or of the punishing diet he is on to display the body fat percentage he does, or that he is amongst the elite in terms of genetics for the sport, and most importantly, of the many, many chemicals he ingests and injects to look the way he does. And lastly, whether or not he ate a chicken breast or drank a whey protein shake would have virtually no impact on the photo of him that you are looking at, or his actual physique for that matter. Usually after a few years of lifting, people become aware that whilst the images are all real in some sense, they are by no means realistic. The projection has ascended to become perception. And here we enter into the hyperreal. And hyperreality as a concept was born of the work of various authors of the 20th century. Umberto Eco, Albert Bogman, and above all, the French author Jean Baudrillard. It is ultimately a concept derivative of semiotics, and it came to life in a time long before anything resembling 21st century technology, much less 20th century technology, had arisen. Now, admittedly, much of semiotics is inextricably linked to postmodern thought and philosophy, and as such should be taken with a grain of salt. But on occasion, there are and have been some interesting insights. Baudrillard's presentation of the hyperreal tends to focus on something that by now we've all grown accustomed to, the relationship of a certain image or symbol that is typically not part of material reality, or in other words, a projection, with some desired outcome or object within material reality. Image or symbol A correlates with thing or object B, and invariably, the thing and object is something that people typically want. The pursuit of perceived happiness or contentment encapsulated in an image or simulation, or to put it another way, the postmodern life can increasingly be reduced to the enactment of perpetual simulacra, whereby the non-simulacral objects of day-to-day life become ever less desirable and bland. The concept of hyperreality can be applied to many things. Political figures such as Ronald Reagan, with the distortive effects of flawed human memory emphasizing the figure rather than the time he lived in or his actual qualities. Historical figures such as Charlemagne. Was he in fact as great as his moniker implies? We simply do not know. Instead, we weld onto such figures, whether fairly recent or more ancient, attributes, properties, and larger-than-life qualities that were never there in the first place. And this would be bad enough. But this type of hyperreal projection is likely amongst the most benign of its kind. If we return to the example of the fitness industry, you have simulacra functioning as objects of normal human desire, even if they are not reasonably achievable on average or achievable at all in many cases. And of course, this is the foundation of much of modern advertising, an image implicated in a state of mind that you are told, whether actively or subliminally, is desirable. But we have yet to encounter the worst of the postmodern world of 2020. And in the past, I've spoken of a distortion of the average when it comes to the mating market and general human attributes. And I spoke of the mean that shall divide us. But under the hyperreal analysis of this, we arrive at a rather frightening conclusion. It is indeed the case that the mean shall divide us, henceforth and likely forever into the future. But the mean is not real, or rather, it is hyperreal. It is the perception that, at best, extreme outliers are representative of an average, with a primary difference being that in earlier times, outliers were able to be identified as such. But in the current era, the bombardment of the 21st century simulacra prevents most humans from achieving this perceptual distinction, and the younger they are, the harder they fall. Because as the layers of the hyperreal have been growing upon each other, the youngest generation has been born into an ever more entwined labyrinth of hyperreal images stacked on top of each other, and mileage will vary, but even older individuals have been taken in by this illusion. This is how you, by the way, get a scenario of a middle-aged man walking through a heavily populated major American city with a sense of bemusement and surprise that he could spot virtually no quote-unquote attractive people. Or in other words, where have all the attractive people gone? If one were a perpetual consumer of the hyperreal, one would quickly gain the mistaken impression that the Chad and Stacy, the most attractive of the male and female archetypes respectively, were omnipresent. Just look at Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, TikTok, or anything similar, and you will see endless rows of boundless beauty, the fairest of the fair. And when you attend to the more mundane needs, such as exercise, thirst, sustenance, or the toilet paper you need to wipe your ass with after you take a very real dump, you spy legions of obese, waddling figurines on the streets, the strange asymmetries of the faces of the many, the plethora of dwarf-like males, though none bearing hallmark dwarven traits of vigor and strength. You are taken back, nonplussed, and left only to puzzle at the state of the world, because your perceptual apparatus has been rendered so dysfunctional by the flow of faulty imagery and information that your image-to-object recognition software has become warped beyond repair. Welcome to the hyperreal, Anno Domini 2020. And a story that illustrates this type of extreme is an article describing the newest millennial trend, whiling away the days with real estate online on such websites as Zillow, StreetEasy, and others, looking at arrangements that are completely unaffordable and making it a mainstay of a daily routine, deranged by an online fantasy, which, by the way, women tend to indulge in far more than men in this particular case. The apartment I found on Zillow has cornflower blue walls and original details, with crown molding still intact, a rarity among today's bleached and flavorless condo renovations. It has picture windows and a functional fireplace, and it's only a couple of blocks from Prospect Park. It isn't perfect. The kitchen is mismatched and hideous, and the second of the two bedrooms is minuscule, little more than a walk-in closet with a window. But it's big enough for a small child, and the place is charming, well cared for, and modestly sized without being a grim shoebox. It would be perfect for my husband and me and our dog, and even a kid if we decided to have one. I can envision our bed frame and a little armchair in the bedroom next to the window, and my favorite of the framed art we own in the dining area. I imagine how I would renovate the kitchen, replacing the metallic backsplash with sunny yellow tile, installing old-fashioned cabinets and a checkered floor. But the apartment costs $850,000, not including homeowners association fees, $570, home insurance, $298, and property taxes, $460. The total monthly cost, according to Zillow, would be $4,546. A 20% down payment would likely be $170,000. A lower down payment, while possible, would carry with it mortgage, insurance, and likely higher interest. Despite the apartment's humble size and middle-class appearance, owning it is an impossibility, a daydream, nothing more. Millennials are less likely to buy a home than previous generations were between the ages of 25 and 39, and it isn't because we don't want to. But as home ownership becomes less of a reality and more of an illusion, many of us resort to merely imagining ourselves in our own homes via the internet. Websites like Zillow, StreetEasy, and Realtor.com, or real estate dedicated Instagram accounts, allow many of us to daydream about the security and stability that we could have if we could buy a home. Meanwhile, we're stuck renting, which even with a decent landlord, research shows, is destabilizing and mentally unhealthy compared with home ownership. The only thing that makes me feel less mad about all the pretty houses I walk by that I look up to see that I can't afford is how fugly the interiors are, via StreetEasy, says Laura, a digital strategist in New York City who requested anonymity. I always look up. I want to know how much it's worth and how much it is appreciated over time, but also to see what ugly ass shit the current owners have done with the inside. And that's that. And this is a prime example of the hyperreal taking precedence over the real, focusing on the inactionable over the actionable. And one could easily pose the question, what's the harm? The now seemingly age-old commentary on the state of the world and its myriad distractions within, the travelers and commuters lost in the reverie of a newspaper reading in the 1950s, the domination of zapping through channel after channel on the ever more obsolete boob tube or television, which so characterized the 1980s. How is it, this time around, any different from any of the things that preceded it? What is more hyper-real about the current stimuli as compared to the past? Isn't this just one generation over-perceiving a sociological threat? Will not, as the old religious adage goes, all be well in the end? Well, yes and no. Every generation has its unique set of problems, unique bugbears, and its unique dragons to slay. Some admittedly greater than others. And behind the warm, fuzzy comfort of one's 1080 plus resolution, it all might seem like much ado about nothing. But conversely, unlike anything that had preceded it, the internet-born hyperreality is a first in the history of the species, and indeed on planet Earth as we know it. One simply cannot cheat millions of years of evolution and expect that nothing negative would come of it. We are, after all, social primates, even the most introverted and isolated amongst us. The fact that many of us, and above all the youngest generation, spend virtually all their time online, assailed by a flood of hyperreal images that are edited dozens of times, photoshopped, and spread and popularized largely through intentional manipulation, has resulted in a breakdown of both our ability to assess reality as it is in the world and to form normal social relationships as we have evolved to do so through face-to-face physical interaction. And one of the worst ailments to arise from the hyperreal simulacra of our age is the amplification of some of our worst vices. The green monster, sometimes called envy, has reared its ugly head in full force, causing misery to all involved. But the object of the envy is more chimera than anything else. The false perception that the normative standard of humans in the current year is a multimillionaire individual possessing unearthly beauty, living a life of unparalleled splendor and happiness, has perverted the contemporary individual into believing that the lack of any of these largely illusory and hyperreal attributes is the death knell of anyone who falls short, which to the current warped mind, inundated by the images it has grown accustomed to, is a vanishingly small minority to which the individual belongs, and this alleged minority status is the source of all his woes. Depression, anger, hopelessness, and ideological intransigence then become mainstays of the psychological diet of such individuals. All the world partakes of ambrosia, spends its days in the Elysian fields, and is appropriately blessed by both Eros and Aphrodite, save I, who, through but a cruel trick of the gods, has been condemned to Tartarian torment, all the while blind to the scooter-bound hippopotamus-like figures whizzing past him at the local Walmart. Because envy only ever looks upwards, and Tartarus can be found in the many echo chambers that fuel the fires of hyperreal rage, reinforcing self-perpetuating conceit day in and day out. But it is possible to recognize that one's mind is spinning tall tales, and that there could and should be a different sort of cognitive dissonance that takes hold of the hyperreal infected mind, waking it up instead of prolonging its slumber. Instead of calling into question the image-to-object reality of earthbound existence, why not instead loudly pose the question as to why virtually nothing seen online bears any resemblance to one's daily experience? Is there actually a disconnect between the imperial realm and the smelly, noisy hustle and bustle of the terrestrial and fleshy prison we call life, or are they one and the same? And anyone paying attention already knows the answer to this question. Perhaps the voices in your head are not even your own. And in the end, we are all stuck with what the gods have given us, no more, no less. That some of us are more blessed than others is not even a question, as clearly some are. But the proportion of such hallowed individuals is not an accurate reflection of human reality, as we know it. It is projection, a world of seeming and aspirant godlings who hide their mortal failings behind a screen. And the fact that they do this should be all the more obvious, because every time you walk out of the house, you will very quickly note the immediate disconnect between what the voices are telling you and what you truly actually see. A bunch of lumbering apes of proportionally mediocre endowment, a far cry from the divine, and this should send you hurtling back to earth each and every time without fail. And I want you to think about something highly relevant here, namely the reverse detective work that every older man, and even some of the younger men going their own way, have engaged in. As back in the day, the unraveling of the blue pill lie required much the same work that the current paradigm does, an appraisal of what is being said and shown versus the boots-on-the-ground experience of virtually every man. Romantic love, warm, comfy lies, built upon houses made of imaginary sand. All these things, when deconstructed and stripped down to their core as deception and tools of manipulation, yield to the discerning man a reality that is far from rosy, but one in which the clay is in fact malleable and can be shaped appropriately towards something simultaneously achievable and realistic. The blue pill lie was hyperreality as well, whether thrown at you in the form of marketing campaigns, romantic films, or your friends and family repeating the lie so often that even they believed it, all reality in front of their eyes notwithstanding. But this is no different. It's a new round of the hyperreal. More intense, more impressive, more overwhelming, but one that can be disarmed by a discerning mind, as such a mind did in earlier times with far fewer resources at one's disposal. This is simply round two, somewhat harder, somewhat tougher, but by no means insurmountable. Whether by intention or not, the demons of hyperreality will do everything in their power to make you delude yourself into complacency and perceived obsolescence. And the only thing standing in the way of that path of destruction is you, rightly apprehending reality and not losing sight of what actually is. Because at the end of the day, you are all you have to work with. And maybe, just maybe, after recognizing that you've been drowning in the hyperreal, you may come to realize that the real has far more to offer than the hyperreal ever purported to. As this channel operates off of the generosity and contributions of its subscribers, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Any and all support is more than appreciated. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.